Well, for those of you who have been to the Archbishop's Lecture Series before, you know the focus of these lectures is on the intersection of faith and culture. And I think our speaker tonight, Dr. Regis Martin, exemplifies that intersection. He's been called a sage for our times. He's been called a man made in the mold of the great Renaissance humanists. He's really someone who I think we'll get a lot out of. He's the author of a half a dozen books. He has a doctorate from the Angelicum University in Rome. He's a professor at the Franciscan University of Steubenville, where I was privileged to be his student. He's the father of 10 children, and he has 5 grandchildren. So let's welcome Dr. Regis.
Thank you, Your Excellency, Archbishop Aquila. I'm honored and delighted to be here, and I am most grateful for the invitation to come to Denver to speak about the Second Vatican Council, which, for those of us who were alive these past 50 years, that may be most of us, I suspect, has been the single most shaping event in the history of the modern church. Those of you who are younger than 50 may have to take that on faith, but the fact is, there is no competition. Without exception, Vatican II made an enormous and singular splash. And it was an extraordinary event that fell upon the Catholic world on October 11th, 1962, exactly 50 years ago tomorrow. It was the feast of the divine maternity of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And what a happy coincidence that was. Perhaps it was divinely inspired, since it is she, Mary, Mother of God, and our Mother, who is and continues to be the deepest meaning of the reality we call church. The church is not finally an institution. The church is a person, a woman, a mother, a virgin, in the purity of whose response to grace and to God we locate the institution. And thus, it is the Marian comprehension of the church that we need to celebrate, to defend, and perhaps even to rediscover. But in saying that, I anticipate somewhat the march of my argument. Plato tells us we must not move too quickly from the many to the one. We have plenty of time to unfold my thesis. But suppose I join issue with that argument, but that I do so at a place in time 400 plus years before Vatican II, at a setting that represents, in fact, the real point of origin of all that has happened since. That place, of course, was the Council of Trent, which began in 1542 and which gave rise to a whole movement of Catholic reform, Catholic revival, of really the most immense and far-reaching proportions. Trent was an enormous undertaking. It was an event of epic grandeur, of far-reaching effect, including, I want to emphasize, including the formative experiences of those who would later have a hand in reconfiguring the life of the Church at the Second Vatican Council. It is good, I think, that we remember these things, that we remember that the men who fashioned the reforms of Vatican II, the Council Fathers, were themselves children of the Tridentine Church. The world of Baroque, Counter-Reformation, Catholicism, a heritage both rich and strange, which genuinely sought to restore the unity of a shattered Christian civilization. The splendor of their salvage attempt, as Hans Urs von Balthasar reminds us in a wonderful little book, Raising the Bastions, the splendor of their salvage attempt has certainly passed away, along with its authentic grandeur as well as its theater of appearances. And the world is that much poorer for its passing. And so I think it essential that we not lose sight of the importance of the Tridentine inheritance, that there not be any sort of discontinuity, disconnect between the two, that the generation that produced Vatican II was not bent on destruction. They were not determined somehow to pulverize every sense of the past, because they felt that here is a patrimony of which we can only be ashamed. In fact, I am myself a child of that world, and all of the distinctive contours of my faith and sensibility were given profound and lasting expression by the work of the Tridentine reformers. And so it isn't my intention, nor was it the design of the framers of Vatican II, to drive a wedge between the two councils, to use Vatican II as a stick or a crowbar with which to dismantle all of the structures of the preconciliar church, to jettison the world of our fathers. Nevertheless, for all of the greatness and nobility of the Tridentine achievement, for all that the church sought to achieve in answering the cry of Luther and Calvin, amid all the Protestant objections to this or that point of doctrine, whether it be justification and faith, or the Mass, the sacraments, and preeminently the Holy Eucharist, when the voice of the church fell like thunder upon the Protestant world in her sweeping defense of the Catholic thing. For all that, Trent did not speak the last word. Indeed, a very strange and persisting silence hovered about her deliberations, which was a silence about the church herself. What do I mean by that? It would appear that none of the decrees issued at the Council of Trent attempted to refute the fundamental Protestant misapprehension concerning the church, namely the assumption about her utter incapacity to set things right. And that strikes me as very odd. Why should that be so? Why this strange silence surrounding Trent? Because, as a matter of course, the Protestants simply denied the whole hierarchical structure of the church, including her authority to teach, to govern, to sanctify. They simply accepted as a given that the fact of the terrible mess the church had gotten herself into could only be remedied by getting rid of the church. When the water in the ecclesial tub is no longer clean, You don't spend a lot of time looking for a special soap. You throw the water out. Yes, even if it means letting the church herself drain away as well. Meanwhile, on the Catholic side, it was equally taken as a given that, of course, the church could set things right. That certainly she had the capacity to regenerate herself, both by teaching sound doctrine, all of those points contested by the Protestant world, we shall answer irrefutably, comprehensively, and also by ridding the true church of every trace of corruption and abuse. In other words, both doctrinal and moral reform. But as regards the nature of the church herself, there was simply no self-conscious reflection on the matter at all. In that sense, the men of the Tridentine Church were very much creatures of their own age. They were medieval men, for whom the age of historical consciousness had yet to emerge. Indeed, the whole modern world had yet to arrive, with its problematic turn to the self, the self-conscious self, followed by the whole endless odyssey of the self-centered self, what we now see as the triumph of subjectivism, what C.S. Lewis has rightly called the poison of subjectivism. These medievals were unaware of that. In fairness to them, they were too busy being church to wonder, well, what is the nature of this church that we are? You might as well ask a fish to reflect on the whole medium of water in which it swims. So, at one level, there is nothing the least bit unhealthy about this medieval mindset. After all, in ages of great artistic flowering, nobody is talking aesthetics. They were too busy making beautiful art. For instance, the great cathedrals of Northern Europe, which, like a lance aimed at the heart of God, sought to reach right into the heavens themselves. Unlike today, of course, when we are inundated with all kinds of theories about art, about literature. But nobody is writing great literature or producing great art. Where is Shakespeare? Where is Dante? We have lost the poetry of the transcendent, and everything has become flat as a map. Henri de Lubac, I think, has understood this when he writes, "The most tradition-minded centuries did the least talking about tradition. Rather, they lived it. They were soaked through with it. The great monuments of tradition were not things to be examined minutely with all the resources of scholarship. Possessed, as these men were, of the thing in itself, they were to some extent freed from the need to conceptualize it." But at a certain point, it becomes necessary to conceptualize, to reflect upon that which you had been living, but had never bothered to question, that which you had taken blithely for granted. And so, 3 centuries later, at the Council of the First Vatican, this gap, or lacuna, is intended to be filled in. and the self-understanding about the church that had never really entered the horizons of Trent was to be placed on the agenda for discussion. In fact, a schema on the church had been drawn up, but alas, it never comes up on account of foreign troops suddenly occupying the city of Rome, the eternal city, which brings the Council of the First Vatican to a crashing close in 1870, thus leaving poor Pio IX a prisoner of the Vatican, while at the same time dispersing some 600 or 700 bishops back to their far-flung dioceses. All of which brings us now right to the threshold of the Second Vatican Council, whose task, mandated by the Spirit, will be to speak of the church, and to do so in a more radical, a more profound way than any other council had done in the past. And you ask yourself, well, how exactly will the church do that? How will she pull this particular rabbit out of the hat? What will the strategy be? What is the blueprint, as it were, of these men who wrote the documents of Vatican II? They were the architects. What were they thinking? Well, the answer they give is a very simple one. Indeed, it is stunningly simple, but it's also paradoxical. They will speak of the church by not speaking of the church at all, but rather they will speak only of him who remains the perpetual font of her being, her life. Because at the deepest level, the church's identity remains anchored wholly on God. The church is shot through and through with glints of his glory. Indeed, the whole point of her origin, her nature, her finality, can only be understood in relation to God. And so it follows that all of the essential aspects of her being, the whole thrust and orientation of her life in all of its institutional expression, can neither be understood nor reduced to the circumstances of this world, the vicissitudes of time, of place. The church can only exist as an immediate radiation of his life. She who is the sacrament of another, of Christ himself, kneeling in ardent, adoring wonder before the Son of the living God, whose enfleshment in time and history bring salvation to the world. Another way of putting it is to say that the church cannot save the world. She is not the ecclesiastical wing of the United Nations. She's not an extension of the American Empire, the Obama administration, or the Romney campaign. In fact, not only can the church not save the world, the church can't even save herself. Only Christ can save the world and can save the church. I am reminded of the reply given by John Myers when he first became Bishop of Peoria. The news media were all over him, and they wanted to know, in which direction will you be moving the church in Peoria? To the left or to the right? And Bishop Myers said, in neither direction, but deeper into the center, into the mystery of Christ. What What that means, of course, is that the only symbolism appropriate to the Church, to an understanding of her life, her mission, is the moon, la luna. She is shorn of all light, all life of her own. And yet she moves in a kind of rhythmic reference to the true light of the world, the Helios, the Son of the Father, who came down upon earth to bathe an entire universe in the glow of his own light, his mercy, his might. The essence of the Church is that she counts for nothing in herself, and that the very life and light about her that counts the most is all that she is not. Indeed, she exists only to be emptied, to be dispossessed. She possesses a light of which she is not, yet because of which she alone is. It is thee, God, we come from, and to thee go. All day long we, like fountain flow, mote-like in thy mighty glow. To borrow a line from the immortal Hopkins, Gerard Manley Hopkins. What the Church is about, then, is the business of mystery. Her métier, her long suit, can be neither machinery nor management. Her primary focus can only be Christ, without whom she is bereft and alone. Indeed, she is less than zero. She is a kind of demonic nothingness without Christ. Whatever post-conciliar confusions there have been, and for some, I will confess, the silly season has gone on and on and on without any abatement in sight, laying waste to whole communities of priests and religious, leaving not a few of the laity in a state of permanent shock. But the reason is always the same. Having lost sight of the central event of human history, which is the incarnation of God, the glory of the Lord falling into the muck and the mire of a broken world. Having forgotten that, they simply cannot see the Church as the very bride and body of Christ, an extension of his own person, whose only reason for being is to prolong that presence, that person, that power in the midst of men. Who then is the real protagonist of the council? It is Christ, who will not go away, who will not submit to the forgetfulness of history, of men and women bent on building the secular city without God, who trivialize his importance, who relegate him to the museum of old and useless artifacts that stand in the way of progress. To all of that, Jesus says no. The Jesus of history, the Christ of faith, is not a secondary character in a third-rate play. Instead, he is the central figure in the drama. Indeed, it is a theodrama. He is the real hero of the play, the impact of whose sudden, unscheduled appearance on the stage of history has become the game changer. Indeed, it is Christ who represents the real and permanent patrimony of the Church herself. And so it seems to me that the whole purpose of the conciliar event is nothing less than a mighty effort mounted by the teaching church to put all Catholics once more in touch with Christ. That is the deepest driving ambition of the Council. That was its highest aim. Of those men who came to Rome in 1962 and in 2 or 3 amazing productive years, hammered out more than 24 decrees and statements of faith on the life and the mission of the bride. And it is this fact, this datum alone, which stands in the way of all the ideologues. Whether liberal or conservative does not really matter. Those men and women who fought to co-opt the council for partisan political purposes. Nowhere was this more evident than in the ongoing struggle over the meaning of Lumium Gentium, the dogmatic constitution on the Church herself, and without doubt the pivotal text in the understanding of the Council. In fact, the wording of the text had scarcely been set down before 2 great factions rose up to begin their protracted tug of war. Who gets power to do what to whom? That became the bone of fierce, unremitting contention. And certainly in this country, the bone has yet to be buried. In any case, the whole theme of the Church found itself almost at once conscripted to ends, wholly politicized by factions bent on power. On one side, there were the numerous and noisy proponents of people power, whose clarion call was, "We are the Church," or "We are Church." They didn't even have time for the definite article. And that found an immediate echo in chapter 2 of the Constitution, the people of God, with its seeming identification of the Church as this vast assembly of impatient lay people on the march, determined to rewrite history in large liberal letters. This was to be the Church of the future, the Church of progress and reform, its members full of endless energy and idealism, whose whole idea of church governance was the Democratic Party, parliamentary procedure, not popes, not cardinals, not pastors. They mustn't tell us what to think, what to do, but rather independent-minded lay people making up their own minds, a sort of herd of independent minds. We are Church. That became the great rallying cry. Meanwhile, on the other side stood all the elements of the old guard, row upon row of doddering clerics, whose views would prove as antique as their costumes, both marinated in the sauces of yesteryear. This is sheer caricature, by the way. But as Chesterton would say, it is sometimes necessary to exaggerate in order to tell the truth. In any case, these reactionary types simply would not budge from chapter 3 of the text, with its so-called fixation on the Church as hierarchy. Not people power, but papal power, pastor power. The church as a pyramid, a top-down managerial model. You pray, you obey, but we tell you what to say. And yet, what neither side understood was the fact that the whole blessed meaning of chapter 2 and chapter 3 totally depended on the meaning of chapter 1, with its blinding affirmation of the church as mystery. By her relationship with Christ, we are told, the church is a kind of sacrament or sign of intimate union with God and of the unity of all mankind. In other words, mystery. The church as mystery. And the mystery which Lumium Gentium invokes is precisely a mystery of communion, communio. Communion with God and man in and through Christ. The very life of the triune God, mediated to the church through the life and death and resurrection of Christ. Now, mystery is a great embarrassment to people of modern progressive persuasion, who are far more hospitable to crunching finite numbers than they are to contemplating the infinite God, especially a God who makes himself so finite, so small, that you and I may approach him without fear or trepidation. Indeed, a God who comes so close to man that we can lay hands on him and slowly torture him to death. Talk about mystery. Here is the most sacredly terrifying mystery of all. Here is the real scandal of particularity. A crucified God, a dead God. And so the appeal to mystery was never meant to become a cover or smokescreen for mystification, because the reality of mystery set out in the document becomes concretely incarnate in a person who bears a unique name, Jesus the Christ. And so, at best, the church is a reflected mystery, deriving her origin, her nature, her importance entirely from him. Christ remains the primordial sacrament. He shows us the face of God. Remember the scene in John's Gospel, Philip wanting to know, when will you show us the Father? And Jesus telling him, have you been with me so long, and still, Philip, old shoe, you don't get it. If you see me, you see the Father. The Father and I are one. He is the sacrament of the Father, the icon of the Father. The church is only the sacrament of Christ. But she is the bride, the body, who really makes present the one with whom she exists. And she does exist in relation to him, in a relation of profound nuptial union and intimacy. As Cardinal Ratzinger was to remind the Synod of Bishops, who had come to Rome 20 years after the close of the Council. Pope John Paul II had summoned them not simply to celebrate an anniversary, but to reclaim a council, to defend the authentic teaching of the council, which stood in grave danger of being hijacked. Cardinal Ratzinger spoke of developments since the council that seemed to be in striking contrast to the expectations of everyone. In other words, Instead of the new Pentecost we had been promised, it looks as if we've got a Babylonian captivity. Between the conception of the council and the outcome, between the idea and its execution, there fell this immense dark shadow. And this, of course, was the crowning irony of the conciliar event. That the more we examined the machinery of the church, the less lovely we found our mother. And so, as Ratzinger reminded the bishops of this most stunning, unexpected development, namely the discrepancy between the intention of the council and its result, he insisted that some analysis be made in order to account for this aberration, this dreadful disparity between the aims of the council and its all too painful aftermath. It is therefore of decisive importance, he told the bishops, to learn to understand the church as mystery in her transcendence toward Christ. The division of power in the church could not be the central theme of the synod. Moreover, and here comes the warhead, aimed right at the heart of those who would disabuse us of the true image of the church. Moreover, a church that speaks too much of herself, that is too concerned with herself, does not in truth speak well of herself. How then does she speak well of herself? By speaking of him. Not machinery, not management, but mystery. She is the sacrament of someone finally greater, transcendent to herself. Once more, the point needs to be made that at the deepest level, the church, like her analog, the moon, radiates a light that does not belong to her. She radiates the light of Christ, who is the true Lumium Gentium, the true light of the nations. Oh, that thou wouldst rend the heavens and come down. So the prophet Isaiah cries out to the hidden God. Oh, that thou wouldst rend the heavens and come down, that the mountains might quake at thy presence. Well, it seems as if God has obliged Isaiah, only in a way that has come to confound the entire world. For no mountain is going to commence quaking in the presence of a helpless child. Yet here is no ordinary child. Here is the eternal child of God himself, come down into the world, into the womb of a woman who first conceived him in her heart and then gives birth to him from her womb. A woman whom, as Bernanos reminds us in a lovely line, a woman who is younger than sin. Who can resist such innocence? Indeed, as Bernanos and Pagis and the Little Flower have often enough told us, the world will be judged by children. The spirit of childhood will rise up on the last day and pronounce judgment upon the whole world. Henri de Lubac, in a beautiful meditation on the Christmas mystery, points us to the unforeseen, unexpected fulfillment of Isaiah's prophecy. The word of the Lord, he writes, has rent the heavens. He has come down into the womb of a virgin and a virgin still bears him in her womb today. This tabernacle of God in the midst of men is the church. And so the two realities, Christ and church, by an act of God himself, are necessarily joined. And the connection they make is an intrinsic and indissoluble one. For just as the body is one and has many members, St. Paul tells us, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. There, the equation is struck. The identity is made. Indeed, it is the sheer interchangeability of the two that gave birth to the expression, long since canonical, of the mystical Christ, the mystical body of Christ. The insight that moved Augustine in a sudden lightning flash to observe that, quote, it is Christ who preaches through Christ. Or 1,000 years later, St. Joan of Arc, who on trial for her life refuses to countenance any confusion between the two, between Christ and his church. It is all one to me, she said, Christ and church. She loved them both. And why? Why is that? Because the world is finally a wedding, mediated by Christ at the still point of its turning. And as the poet Hopkins reminds us, Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limbs and lovely in eyes not his, to the Father through the features of men's faces. Or even coming down to our own time, Karl Rahner, for heaven's sake. In the last years of his life, he confessed that in the end, all the rage, the disappointment, the resentment were entirely beside the point. That when he heard the word church, what it meant to him was nothing less than, quote, the absolute promise of God in Jesus Christ to be with him forever. Shall I remain in the church? He asks. The question drives me crazy. It is like asking if I will still be a human being. Surely it was on the wings of such insights as these that Vatican II sought to renew the life of the church. Not just as an institution that endures because she has somehow survived all these crises, but as a life that is passed on, filling her children with the things of God. And it's not as if the church had not taught right doctrine before, or that somehow the life of holiness had been leached out of her life. Nothing is more imbecilic than to try and detach the Council of the Second Vatican from all that had gone before, as if little puffs of magic had fallen all at once from the sky, that sun-drenched October day when good Pope John announced his new Pentecost. It seems to me, if you stand on the shoulders of giants, it's not a good idea to break faith with them, unless you want to end up in a bloody ditch. All of those wise and spectral figures who have gone before us, blazing a trail that you and I are now privileged to follow. Chesterton's Democracy of the Dead, giving votes to that most obscure of all classes, our ancestors. Well, you've been very patient, so let me try and wrap this up. I have a flight tomorrow, also. Late in the day, but still. If we imagine the church as a very old and wise woman, why should we not want to heed her advice? Or if you think of her as a young, blushing bride for whom Christ shed his blood, why would anyone want to set about despoiling her beauty, her innocence? As de Lubac puts it, don't those who accept Jesus while rejecting the church, don't they know that in the last analysis, they have the church to thank for him? That was a question de Lubac put to the enemies of his mother, who is our mother also. For us, he writes, Jesus is living. But under which sandhill would perhaps not his name or memory, but his living influence, the effect of the gospel and of faith in his divine person, under which of those sandhills would all of that lie buried, were it not for the continuity of his church? Without the church, Christ would be bound to evaporate, crumble, become extinguished. And what then would mankind be were Christ to have been taken from them? Not a bad set of questions to put to those who despise and reject the church. Unless such people disdain Christ no less than the church he founded. And maybe that is, at the end of the day, the deepest ground of their rejection. That their quarrel is not so much with the church as it is with God. With the Father, who in sending his Son to suffer and die, pitched his tent too intolerably close to those who, after all, do not think they need saving. And why, really, why must the world's salvation turn on a single pinpoint of light and life in the great sea of history? The still point, no less, of the turning world. The point where time and eternity, nature and grace, history and heaven come together. Come into sudden and shocking interface. I don't know. You may be relieved to know that I don't know. Gregory of Nyssa doesn't know either. He says, if all things were within our grasp, the higher power would not be beyond us. So it is good that I don't know. Otherwise, I would be God. And what a heap of trouble we would all be in then. But this much I do know, that the grace of God has appeared, and that the Word became flesh, and that the promised deliverance from sin and death we all long to possess has precisely happened, and continues to happen in the life of the church. This deeply suspect institution, which it is so very easy to dislike, to loathe, because humanly speaking, the church, after all, is filled with people like you and me. I'm not a great fan of Andrew Greeley, but once and again, a broken clock is right. And he said once, you want a perfect church, and you want to go out and found one, go ahead, be my guest. But remember this, the perfection of that church you join will be diminished by your presence and membership in it. Or Flannery O'Connor, the only thing that will make this terrible world we are coming to endurable is the church. And of course, the only thing that makes the church endurable is that she is somehow the body of Christ. And on this body, you and I are fed. She whom God himself fashioned as he lay dying upon the cross. Let us love the church. Let us love her as a gift which none of us himself can give. A blessing which all of us are grateful to receive. Thank you very much. There was a great tension before the council and during the council between two tendencies or movements or currents. Aggiornamento, which is the Italian word for updating. Let's reform and renew these structures, make them more efficient. And ressourcement, a French word which literally means resource. Go back to the source. Those two currents, I think, come together. They coalesce in a very creative and fruitful way at the council. What is it that we resource? Christ. We go back to the beginning, back to the start. Aggiornamento has that wonderful little Italian word, giorni, which means day, which means light. So aggiornamento ought to open up more light. It's not just tinkering with the structures, changing the language from Latin to a kind of vernacular. It doesn't mean the skirts, the hem of sister's skirt goes up a few inches. Or father's beretta is taken off and put in mothballs. That's not the aggiornamento they had in mind. And throwing open those windows, it wasn't just to let in the fresh air of the modern age, because much of that air was toxic. We throw open those windows so that we can shout all the more loudly, more robustly, the truth that we have. Propagate it, share it, diffuse it. And how do you do that? Return to the sources. Go back to the beginning. What else do we have to offer save Christ? That should be the weapon of evangelization. Give people Jesus. Like Pope John Paul II, shortly after becoming Pope, he said to the Russians, the Soviets, who were occupying his country, the Poles demand God. We want God. And they repeated it often enough that even the Kremlin could hear it, and eventually it brought down that evil empire. Faith. It was the faith of Christ that vindicated, that vanquished that world, that tired, old, boring world of bourgeois communism. So, faith. Faith is the answer. Yeah, I think the Pope is inviting us to rediscover faith, the origin of faith, the source of faith, Christ, who is the object of faith, who is its culminating point. When you die, and let's presume God is reading your mind, not just JD, you'll go to him, you'll go to heaven, and you won't need faith. You will have the certainty of knowledge. You will be embraced by the arms of God forever. Charity will, of course, subsist. It will perdure forever. So faith is ultimately less important. But in terms of the dynamism of living out Christian discipleship, it is primary. It is the most important. Without faith, you don't have hope, and without faith, you can't exercise love, charity. So the Pope is pretty emphatic that people try and return to faith. They get reacquainted with their own baptism. The Pope speaks of baptism as the final mutation in the evolution of the human species. And what you receive in baptism is faith. It's objective, it's palpable, but it needs to be appropriated. Take ownership of this faith. Explore its riches. Don't take it for granted. Don't give it away. But it is important, I think, that we recover a sense of the church as woman, as mother, virgin, Mary. when the Council Fathers voted on where do we stick the understanding of Mary in the treatise on the church, overwhelmingly they said she belongs in the church. Not a separate treatise. The cheese does not stand alone. She's integrated into the life of the church, and Pope Paul pronounced her Mater Ecclesia. She's the mother of the church. She's also the perfect pilgrim, the perfect exemplar of what it means to be church, which means her arms are outstretched all the time. She's a beggar. My great mentor, Luigi Giussani, likes to speak of the beggar as the true protagonist of history, because he alone has an authentically human posture, arms outstretched, asking God to fill them. I have nothing, I entreat you to give me everything. That's Marian. Mary had nothing, but she was hungry for everything. And that everything entitled her to become God's mother. So she is the perfect model of the church. And Joseph must have been an extraordinary guy to live with her, to be able to face that kind of holiness day after day, plus sitting next to the Incarnate Word. That's pretty intimidating, pretty convicting. He must have been a humble guy. No wonder he had so little to say. He's bathing in all of this beauty. So look to Mary. Return to Mary. I mean, people should cultivate a relationship with Mary. She's your mother, after all. And she doesn't scold you as often as the others do. She's very forgiving.